Well, how about the stories that we heard about Father Bowdern that we just thought, what this is religious propaganda? What are you talking about? We're not buying into this. And then the book comes out and we realize what he's done. And we go, oh my goodness. And I've told Tom, my good friend Tom Gettleman, who is as wonderful a person as you can possibly imagine, but who in his little devilish ways as a freshman put a kick me sign on the back of Father Bowdern. And I said, you're doomed. You're toast. I don't care what you do. You put a kick me sign on the back of the Exorcist, you're going to hell.
Father William Bowdern was probably the most kind teacher we had. I think his connection to the St. Louis exorcism was another kind of mind-blowing thing to know about a teacher that kept us all somewhat interested. He was tormented by the guys in our class. We put notes in his belt and talked out a lot, but he never lost his temper and he was always very calm. And I remember him saying over and over, now boys, now boys, now boys, to try to get us to calm down. And the other thing was his only textbook was the New Testament. And I still have that book from sophomore year, the New Testament that we used as a textbook.
And I have to say, in Father Bowdern's class, what happened in that class was so sad when you reflect on the fact that the guy was probably a saint and we just tortured him mercilessly. And, but in that class one time, we had been messing up, been acting up, and he kept us after school. And of course, nobody likes that. Everybody wants to get out. And he had kept us in class, and McElroy storms out of the class, even though we were supposed to stay, and just takes off. And after Bowdern had said we needed to stay in. But what cracked me up was Don Martini, who McElroy and Martini were thick as thieves. Martini says, Father, I'll go get him. And he rushes out of the room. And I could see him perfectly. He runs out of the room. I'm going to get him, Father. I'm going to get him. He runs out the room and then he just stays there like 1 foot outside the door. And he waits for a minute. And then he comes back in and says, Father, I tried to catch him, but he just turned around and says, I don't care what that old man says. So
freshman religion, had Bowdern and Hagan, so it was Bowdern, I don't know, 4 days a week, and Hagan came in and did the Fridays or something, and of course Bowdern, what, speaking of entertaining, I mean, he gave us so much material from his stories about Johnny Riley and how to keep from touching yourself and all of that stuff. And our class, I don't know if you've heard this story from anybody else, but Bowdern, or was it Hagan? So I think it was Hagan. So Hagan was doing one of his sex talks in class, and and he got raunchy as he usually did, and Tom Dunham fainted, and just like suddenly was sitting there, and he got real white, and he fell out of the chair onto the floor, and Father Hagan said, oh, that always happens, or happens a lot, to when we're learning about sex, so he asked somebody to take Dunham out, in the hall and stuff. And then anyway, so then like a week later when we had Bowdern, and somebody said, oh, Father Bowdern, can you tell us about Johnny Riley again, and talk about his temptations with petting and with the girls. And so, Bowdern's, oh yeah, Johnny Riley, and so again, I'm sure it was Rick Spur. So Bowdern was about 3 or 4 sentences in, and Rick stands up and swoons and faints and onto the ground. And I forget who his partner was, but then somebody, one of the other guys in the class said, "Oh, Father, I'll take him outside for some air." And so the two of them then left class and never came back.
Played golf with Sondag pretty frequently, and we were talking about what the answers were. We were cheating him in that, and he said, "Who are you going to say?" And I said, "Chuck Conway." And he said, "That's what I'm going to say too." I thought Chuck Conway, looking back in retrospect, I thought he was a more than pretty decent human being. I thought he treated you fairly. I thought he taught a lot of things, life lessons. Was, he had to snoop around, but I guess that was his job. I got kicked out of chemistry, which was probably a lifesaver. I didn't flunk it because I went with Chuck for the rest of the semester, and I'd help him out. He took about 2 sessions trying to teach me chemistry, and then came to the realization that it wasn't going to happen. So he gave me a test on whether the symbols, and I could figure that one out. But we go out one day, and Saliga was in the class too, and he was always creating havoc. And I said, I'm not the only guy that throws stuff out the window. So we go out, and he's sneak up to Oakland Avenue on the sideway, and he's looking at the street, and all you can see is Bunsen burners and the rubber stoppers and the little glass tubes coming out the windows. And
I'm going to give you an answer that you're probably not going to get from a lot of people, and that is Mr. Conway. And I'll tell you why. I said in my life talk that, I didn't have a lot of money, and I went to Mr. Conway. I had been working at the ballpark actually, and that ended, and I needed a job. So I went to Mr. Conway and I said, if you hear of anything, let me know. Well, he found me this part-time job, which really helped me out all through high school. It was the only way I had any money, really. So that was the first thing, and I will never forget him for that. But the second thing is probably a little more important. I got in trouble a couple times in high school, primarily over alcohol. One I was barely involved in, and the other one I certainly was. And I remember him pulling me aside, after I did my requisite suspension and all of that, and just really giving me a heart-to-heart talk. And he told me, he knew I was a good student, and he just said, you're just wasting it. You've got to get yourself together, or these things are going to come back and kill you someday. So those two things were really important to me, and I think I grew up a lot after that, because I could see he was really intentional, and it wasn't a talking to down or anything like that. But those things made a real impression on me. But I'll first and foremost, the fact that, and I tell you, it probably wasn't a week after I had asked him about work that he found me this job. So I mean, I knew he had spent some time trying to put something together, and I really appreciated it.
I do have a lot of respect for Mr. Conway, in large part because he is such a what's the right word? He is not a guy I would have picked to be the principal enforcer of discipline at a school like SLU. I mean, he looks exactly the opposite of what one would expect. But in all honesty, I thought that he did his job really well. I mean, he was very dispassionate. He enforced the rules. It was clear. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of excuses and this and that. I mean, it was basically, you got 5, you go in, serve your time, you get out. I thought he did a really good job, and I really enjoyed those times when he would walk into the cafeteria and you know, somebody was playing on the jukebox. Don't you want somebody to love? I think it was Every Day. And he would come in and he would make a face, and everybody would go wild.
Conway was a very big influence on me. And there were so many positive things I got out of being at SLU. But the best was my relationship with Charles T. Conway. He was a great guy, even though some people didn't like him because they felt his wrath occasionally. But his wrath was put on. He could be very strict and stern, but he had to work at that. That was not his natural demeanor. And he did that for our benefit so that we would take things seriously. I had a parking ticket. And for some, I guess that was the system back then. You didn't mail it in, you had to go down to court and pay it. And my date was in the middle of, at the beginning of a school day. And me and my friend, he was going to drive me down there. And I asked Conway if we could come in late the next day. He said, oh yeah, that's not a problem. Come in late, but just bring a note from your parents. I said, see, that's the problem. If I tell my dad I get a parking ticket, I don't drive probably for the rest of my life. He says, I'm sorry, I can't do it without a note. So we're walking away. I'm dejected. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. We're almost out the door, and Conway goes, hey, wait a minute, come back here. And he goes to my friend, who I don't want to name because I don't know if he wants this story told. But anyway, he goes to my friend and he says, hey, I need somebody to go get some chalk. The teachers are out of chalk and they're upset. Do you know where the teacher supply store is? Yeah. Okay, here's $20. Tomorrow morning on the way to school, would you stop and buy $20 worth of chalk? And he goes, and I don't want you doing it alone. Take somebody with you so you're safe. And he goes, and I don't know where this place is, so I don't know how long it'll take you to do that. That was his workaround.
In fact, there was a time when they gave me a lot of grief and I just said, I don't need this anymore. And I left and I took off and I was going down South Kings Highway, and Chuck comes and picks me up and says, you know, give it a try.
When I wrote my doctoral exams, one thing was they had you write an essay about somebody who influenced you in your life as a educator. I wrote about Charles T. Conway, and it was one of the best things I ever wrote. And you know, you hand it in, and I don't have a copy. Years later, I went back to Columbia to get a copy of it, and my advisor still had it, so we copied it, and then I copied it. I still have it someplace, and I made a copy for Conway. And one day, just out of the blue, I drive to SLU. Conway's not, at that time, Conway was teaching science, which was his first love. And I just walked in on his classroom and saw him and sat in while he finished that class. And luckily he had some time off after that. And he was showing me around the building. I hadn't been there for a couple of years. And we're talking and everything. And I give him the essay that I wrote about him. And he says, oh, I'm going to enjoy reading this, I'm sure. But then he takes me into the lounge and he's introducing me to all of these teachers, none of whom I knew. And he starts talking to them and they're talking to me. What was it like back then? All this kind of stuff. And what was Charlie like back then? Everybody called him Charlie. And finally, one of these teachers looked at him and go, Charlie, is this the Steve that did such and such? And somebody else goes, oh yeah, I remember a story about you when you did this, that, and nothing. They all had stories about something I had done and Charlie had told them that. And we all had a good laugh about that. And I'm walking out with him. He's walking me to my car. And I go, Mr. Conway, I know some of those things I did, but there's some that I don't remember I did. And he goes, I know, but over the years, it was just easier to put one name with all the things that happened. So he says, you're not the only name, but you're one of them.
Mr. Dugan, or Father Dugan. But two things. Wasn't he the guy that would invite people to come in and speak to us like out of the blue? I think one guy was from a far right group, and not necessarily talking about firearms or anything, but something I can't remember, something society. And his whole premise was, you will sit there and you will listen to these people, you will ask intelligent questions, and then we're going to have an exam on it tomorrow. And then the other important thing was, and I don't know if you noticed in the news, March was Women's Month, right? And they're talking about pay inequities between men and women. And I thought, no, wait a minute. Wasn't there a speaker, or I think girls from one of the major high schools came in and presented to us the inequities of women in employment. And I'll be honest, at first I thought, where are they coming from? What do you mean? Are there inequities? And apparently they were well prepared. They, because I was ready to shoot them all down, but I didn't have anything to shoot them down with. So that guy was incredible to me. And the thing that he mentioned to me, this is back during the protest phase of our 4 years. There was something going on downtown that weekend, and I was talking to him about it. I said, I think I'm going to go down there and participate. And he said, yeah, Bill. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, believe me, so it's not his words. But basically, he said, you can carry signs and you can protest march and you can burn candles and you can burn flags. And he said, and he said, that'll get you, if you're lucky, a little 5-second thing on TV. There's no mass media back then. Or maybe in the Post-Dispatch, you get it on the cover. He said, or you can change it from within. He says, what that means is you're going to have to go into organizations that, A, you either need to change the way they operate, or B, you need to force them to see your point of view, and therefore you have to become one of them. And maybe not necessarily that, but join a society or join an established profession or organization that disputes these things, and you make your case. And he said, the reason that people don't do that, he said, that's harder to do than burn the flag or go on the march. He said, people like to do the easy stuff. People don't like to do the hard stuff. And it was like, boom, that just exploded in my head, and I'll never forget that. And I thought, okay, yeah, I can be the news headliner, or I can be the guy behind the scenes working.
Dennis Dugan was Dom Kalachi's assistant on the freshman football team. And he taught a political class, and he brought in, I will never forget, he brought in a very conservative, what was the organization? John Birch Society. He brought in someone from the John Birch Society to speak to us. And none of us really knew who the John Birch Society was then. And I just find that very unique that in 1968, probably, he brought a John Bircher in to talk to us.
His closing thought was, I can teach you. I'm not teaching you if I am just telling you what you already know, but you have to start to think of what you don't know and why it exists and what could be the outcome from there. And I thought, and that stuck. I mean, I'm not giving it true, I'm paraphrasing loosely, but that really, really stuck. I mean, why teach us what we already know? We, think about something else.
Denny Dugan really taught us the Socratic method, and I'll never forget. Of course, I say I'll never forget, and then I have forgotten what the subject was, but it was the first time anybody ever said, "What do you believe about something?" Okay, argue the other side of it. And not only was it great for all kinds of reasons that are valuable throughout your life, but it really did, I think, open my eyes to making sure, well, there is a reason they think this way, even if I don't believe it or I don't agree with them. It comes from something. And of course, as an adult, you realize, well, so many things, all of us, even though we have so much in common, I was talking about this in Man Reason the other day, even though we have so much in common because of being in the same town, same school, all this stuff, every one of us has a completely different experience in getting there. And so how all of those experiences shaped what your opinion is, I thought that he really brought that out.
In your face kind of guy. And I can remember even the basketball intramurals. There was the Jesuit team or the Scholastic team or whatever. And he wasn't hesitant about throwing an elbow or cheap shot in you or whatever. He let you know he was going to do it. And I really like the guy. I never had him for any classes, but he might have been a freshman football. Kalachi was coach. Dugan might have been the assistant at that point in time, but he was not. Some of those scholastics were kind of quiet and subdued or whatever. Dugan was not. He was a shit disturber.
Another extremely influential person was Dennis Dugan. I graduated college wanting to be a high school teacher, and though it's something I never did, I actually taught adults for many years in junior colleges and extension programs. And I attribute my love of teaching, particularly social science, history, things of that nature, to Dennis Dugan. He was just a remarkable teacher. As other people have said, he just really forced you to think about things, to consider why you might have a particular opinion, to question yourself, question others. I mean, he brought people into the class who, were just like folks we would have never encountered otherwise. My senior project was actually teaching American problems classes at the U High. So I taught, I guess it would have been juniors. He actually let me design a survey on racial attitudes and give it out to people. And, later in life, I discovered what it means to actually develop a, reliable and valid survey, which this was not at all. But he let me do it, and we used the results. And in fact, when I became Secretary of Student Council, I shared some of those results with Joe and others as a way of trying to sensitize and open people to some of the racial attitudes at school. I actually once went out to DeSmet when Dennis Dugan moved out there after he was at the U High, and I was one of those sort of crazy people from the outside that he brought into a class. I lost track of him. I have no idea where he is today, but he is so clearly was a very, very influential person for me personally. And I attribute a lot of who I am today and how I see the world today to him.
I can remember Ebbie Dunn, God, my shins hurt. I'd flunk a math test and he'd come by and kick me in the shins and say, show up later on, we'll take it again. And I had a couple opportunities, but I didn't have the grades. And he would just say, keep taking you got to persevere, just keep taking the stuff. And, it taught me a lot about life. It taught me when you're down, you got to keep getting up. And
I would say the one who was most impactful for me was Ebbie Dunn. And I never had him in class. I think what the main thing that Ebbie Dunn did was, I want to say that August of 1970 was probably the most significant month of my time at St. Louis U High, and probably one of the more ones in my life. I was really kind of full of myself. After the second semester, junior year, I had 39 demerits that semester. And I'm embarrassed that you never got one. But I had to go through a period of disciplinary board that summer. My mom got a letter from Father Bailey about me. I was still pretty cocky. And I just bumped into Ebbie Dunn in August. And he looked at me as only Ebbie Dunn can do. And he said, I understand you got an attitude. And he said, babe, you better lose the attitude. If you don't lose the attitude and I hear you do anything else or have any more problems, you're not playing football. That was the end of it. And that was the end of my attitude. I respected him that much, and football was that important to me. So I realized at that point in time, there were things that were important in my life that I could screw up and lose.
And, Ebbie Dunn is another one that, very intimidating guy. I had him for freshman algebra. He'd walk into that class and he'd take that algebra book and he would bang it on the pedestal of the tabletop. And you just knew this was what high school was about.
I think about, and again, I'm going back to Ebbie Dunn, and he's not the only one. There were tremendous teachers there throughout. But when Mike Weesey's brother got killed and Mike learned, who did they pick to drive Mike home? And that had to be tough duty for Ebbie Dunn, because he knew Bob Weesey well. You're driving a kid who just learned his brother died. Picked Steve Walsh Mike picked Steve Walsh to ride with him. I thought often about that ride from all three of those guys' perspective, what that was like. And then arriving at the Weesey household and what that was like for all three of those guys. And, that's above and beyond.
There was another teacher I should have mentioned that I went to now, and that is Father Hagan. How can a man know 800 kids' names and then as another class graduates, learn a whole new class of names? Just an amazing man. Amazing.
Marty Hagan, of course, and one little story about him, of course, legendary about his being able to remember all the names, and just, again, what a fantastic thing that he did. But I saw him, well, actually, he saw me at least 20 years later, and I was ahead of him in the hallway, and he called, Rogers! And he told me he recognized me from my walk. And he actually said, and I guess I had two brothers who went there before me, Kevin and Paul, and he said, you all walk the same. I was like, well, I'm not surprised you would know that.
Would you have ever worried about any of us going berserk under the watchful eye of Father Hagan? No. I mean, man, I was scared of that dude. And he would just materialize like Harry Potter. He would just materialize over your left or right shoulder. And he would say something, and I forget what his honorific was. He would call you something, but I don't remember what it was. And he would just, and there would be this sort of disembodied voice over your shoulder, and that's another thing. Father Hagan's sudden apparition right over your shoulder, usually when you were doing something that was just borderline bonkers.
And another person was Father Martin Hagan, who was our freshman religion teacher, and also ran the rec hall, gave me my first demerit, which I told you was totally undeserved because Jim Nyer didn't use a blast pad. But he tried to give us advice about sex. And, now I think looking back that he knew very little or nothing about sex. So.
But the one that surprisingly over the years I remembered was Father Kane, who taught, I guess we called it English composition. It was writing. And, he was so boring. Did you have Father Kane? He had that monotone delivery. We called him Novocaine, I remember. And he was a brilliant teacher. And throughout my career, I always found myself being able to write really well. And people would always marvel at how well I could write. And I thought I was just, the average guy. But I appreciated later how effective he was at teaching writing. And so I would say Novocaine probably was the guy who probably had the most lasting effect on me throughout my career.
Father Kane was one of my English teachers. And, when even at the time, I think he seemed a lot older to me than he actually was. And, my first impression of him was that he was a fuddy-duddy. And maybe he was, but actually he taught English rather well. And I have actually benefited from his suggestions about how to write for a long, long time. I don't know how important that is. Well, it's actually pretty damn important if you go into academics, and which I did. And that, I think that was, pretty important.
I don't know about, life impactful, but I thought there were some really good educators there, and I'll run through some that were not so popular. So freshman year, there was a Jesuit named Father Kane, and he taught English. I don't know if you had him or not. And he taught from this basic book of English grammar, diagramming sentences and all of that sort of stuff. And I hated it. I mean, I thought it was the most boring shit I ever had. Probably turned out to be among the most useful classes. And I don't know if you've had this experience in your working life, but I used to get stuff written and sent to me, and I'm like, I can't pass this on. This isn't even a complete sentence. And I got laughed at many times by subordinates for being a frustrated English professor. So, so you look back at something you hated turned out to be extremely useful,
Father Phil Kellett was someone who I never had as a teacher, but I knew that the students kind of revered him. And my experience of him was walking into a pep rally where, 800 guys were screaming and yelling, and going to the podium and everybody just getting quiet and sitting down to where you could hear a pin drop. And then he would quote St. Paul's letter to Corinthians, and he would, with emphasis at the end of each sentence, he would bang his pointer down on the podium. And so I remember that.
Another one, Father Kellett definitely had a huge impact on me. You're half terrified and half in love with the guy.
Well, I remember going on a trip to New York City and Washington, D.C. after my freshman year with Father Kellett. I thought that was probably the most impressive thing I did. For some reason that stuck with me, that I guess it was fun, it was educational, and I learned a lot doing that. I got to sit down and eat with Father Kellett. Some of these people, we never sat down to eat with them. Mm-hmm. And we never really interacted with them in their quarters or did ordinary things. But on that trip, I got to meet Father Kellett in a way I assume most people never got to meet him. And because, he was walking around, he felt very comfortable in New York City. You really wouldn't think that. Like you'd think he was just some kind of slew junkie or something, always selling book bags or something, but actually he We went to Mama Leone's in New York City and sat down to a dinner you couldn't eat like in a week, like 7-course meal. I never went to a 7-course meal, and it was very nice. And it's something I've never had a meal like that ever since. I never had a 7-course meal since. So that was one thing that happened that I thought was I connected with Father Kellett there in a way I probably never connect with anybody else, because we never did anything like that.
You talk about the smoking. Back then, all this classrooms on the first floor and second floor had those open casement windows that would swing. Father Kellett would take that last pull of his Camel and flick it right out the window. And the guy had stopped. He knew exactly how to flick it.
And Father Luebke specifically, because we did a lot of self-work, and you'd look up the answer in the answer book and, come take it to him when you were done. Well, he had at least one case where that answer was wrong in the book, but he wouldn't tell you that until a really long time. So I learned that no matter how right you think you are, maybe not.
I looked through the yearbook. I remember Father Luebke taught me more algebra in my 3rd year than I think most teachers could teach me in 3 years. He actually, it was 2nd year now that I think about it, and I scored very high on the math scores on the SAT, and I think it was because of Father Luebke. I would say he was some kind of perfected teacher personally. I didn't really like him at the time, but man, without doing any homework, I learned more algebra from that guy. And I did become a mechanical engineer, so that was used.
Father Luebke, okay, geometry. Whoever had him knows that he'd teach a little bit, then he'd put you with a partner and you'd work on problems together, and he would walk around the room, and here I am copying off I always remember whose paper it was, Keith Beale, okay, and I think it was English, and I lost track of Luebke in the room, and there he is peering over my shoulder, and he didn't ask a question, he didn't say nothing. He picked up both papers and ripped them in half. So Keith is going, "Where's my paper?" Oh, I had a little problem. So, everybody got their own little stories about that stuff, so.
Father Ed O'Brien, our senior religion teacher, who I think tried to teach us more philosophy than religion, some pretty heavy duty stuff with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning and Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit, a lot of which I think kind of went over our heads. But I remember one time asking him or telling him that I didn't understand something and asking for an explanation. And he said, Vander, the problem with you is that right now you're here. And he took his hand and did this. And he said, but when I'm finished with you, you're going to be here. And he raised his arm. And I just remember like looking at him like, what are you talking about? And I guess he just wanted to elevate us in some way or another. And maybe he did that. I don't know.
And I have often thought about that. And the thing that always strikes me is I always mention Father O'Brien. The class we took with him senior year, he presented to us the kind of questions that everybody asks or should ask about their life. And if you can't pass muster on those questions, you knew that you should get deeper into it and find out why not. I just think he's always been the one that in that regard affected me. He kind of, it was at that point, I felt able to just kind of throw the catechism out the door because I had a way of applying standards to situations, to people, to social and personal relationships that really just made me know what direction to take on things. And it was a huge confidence booster.
And that's it. It's that kind, and then the kind of just flexible thinking that, and like O'Brien, is another one. It was O'Brien's philosophy class. Reading the existentialists, having him give the broader perspective that I think the more open-minded perspective that we learn from that.
The retreats. He did the retreat too. Now, and I can still see him trying to explain Kierkegaard.
And then OB, Father O'Brien, he's the one guy that I think most influenced me through my life. Well, from what he did, he was just a great guy.
I think Father O'Brien was a really, really good teacher. And the other part of the whole experience, which they don't do now, is how many times we had to go to Mass, which in my own mind, I have banked, obviously, hundreds of Mass experiences that I have drawn on in later years. But for the most part, the Jesuits were good homilists, preachers, and I think he was the best of them. And his sermons never ran long, but they always were to the point, well done. And that came out, I had him for, philosophy and literature senior year. And that was an interesting intellectual exercise too, because, we studied existentialism, and which I don't imagine was going on in too many high schools back then. So I think, and then another aspect that he was involved in for me was going on retreat, which I did right before, it was in December, so it was before Christmas. And it had a significant effect on me in the sense that I know that I was thinking about more spirituality, but also bringing me out of a bit of a shell. And we came back, and everybody, I think that experience was very common, if not universal. And then the next Monday, it was, if you want to try out for the play, today's the day. I think that maybe even confidence or good feeling, peace of mind or peace of heart, I went ahead and did it. And I wonder if I would have done the tryout without having gone to the retreat.
Father O'Brien in senior year philosophy and kind of taught me to think for myself. And I still used to see him because I would go to White House once a year with a group of guys from my parish here. And it was good to catch up with him. I'm sorry that he passed.
Later on in school, I guess junior or senior year, ended up taking calculus with Mr. Schulte. And it's kind of amazing, that guy, he's so brilliant with his drama and theater and all that he could teach calculus as well. He must have been a really bright guy. But he was very kind of calm in a very difficult class, and was very helpful too.
One of the faculty members was Joe Schulte, senior year for me. I had been an excellent math student, geometry, algebra, trigonometry. I always had A's, I had many teachers, and I got to calculus senior year. And going to calculus class was like trying to learn Chinese in 2 lessons. And here I went in super confident, and I left on a real low, but Joe Schulte drugged me through it. Extra time after class. And he always called me Milford Man because He grew up 2 doors from where we moved in Shrewsbury. He was a Shrewsbury guy. So I can't thank Joe Schulte enough for dragging me through that.
The other memory is with Schulte. Mr. Schulte, he of course taught calculus, and the Russell twins were in our class, and they like were born to it. And I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? You know, sines and cosines, and oh man, this just isn't it.
And I was with Mr. Vitale, you know, when he would drag his face down when he got upset, you know, if you remember that before they had, you know, really good stage makeup back then, he could do it with his hands.
Who I had for typing, and I remember, I mean, actually, I thought he was a great economics teacher, and I learned a lot there. But the thing I remember most from his class, and I pointed this out to him 30 years after the fact, I said, Joe, you know, you were a good teacher. I remember all that supply demand stuff, but what I really remember you saying was taking a dump was life's most underrated pleasure. And he said, he goes, oh, you wouldn't believe how many people tell me that. It's like, well, you know, you had a real impression on me. I thank you virtually every day.
Bull in the ring for typing class. Okay, all you guys get in there. Let's see who can type the fastest. You know.
Vitale was like that for all his craziness. Yeah, I mean, I was amazed. Did you ever take the economics with him where you did the investing in stock? Well, I took it and I actually came in second, which kind of amazed. I got lucky. Well, what happened was I went down to the library trying to meet girls and stuff, but I actually spent time reading a book, Fortune magazine. I bought this sugarcane company, Holly Sugar, and they got bought. And so I did really, really well on it. Well, at the end, he says, I think Mark Jacobs, or Jacobson, not Mark Jacobs. Mark Jacobson won. And he said, you know, come on up and explain how you did. And he said, well, my dad works. He's a big shot at Merrill Lynch. So he just gave me some guy's name and he told me what to pick, and off I came. And said, and, you know, Vitale made some smart ass remark about, well, gee, that a lot of work you put into it. So he said, how'd you do? I said, I read this magazine and talked about this and I bought it. He said, you actually looked this up? I said, yeah. And because the class was mixed, so to speak, he kind of said, well, this shows that even somebody who doesn't have all the talent that other people have can do okay. And that kind of inspired me. And believe me, I've been doing a lot of that for a number of years based on somebody giving me just a little bit of praise and saying I could do something rather than saying, you're not the brightest guys in the world, get lost, you know?
And then later, it was my responsibility to give a speech at the graduation. I don't know if you remember that or not. And I wrote this speech out and I said, hey, Jack, can you help me punch this up a little bit? And I'm sure he was busy and he said, yeah, okay, come on over. And I did. And oh my God, I needed bandages. He said, read that sentence. And I read this sentence. It was so stilted. And he said, what are you trying to say? And I said, well, this is what I'm trying to say. He said, why didn't you write that? And he just kept doing that. Line after line, word after word. And at the end, we had something. And so that inspired in me a love for writing that was long, life lasting. I ended up going into journalism and then I wrote a lot, and then I ended up in business for 30 years and got back to writing. And I have to tell you, I relived that experience. I said, would you look at this manuscript? And he looked at the manuscript for Bull in the Ring. And at first he said, yeah, it's okay. And he gave me some input. I had this thing on the Fantastics in there, which he directed when we were in high school. And then I took all of his advice. Great stuff. Great. He said, you introduce Pat Bannister in the first part, and then you don't hear from him again for 100 pages. And so things like that, writing stuff that I never knew. I wasn't an author. I wasn't a writer really. And so I did all that, and I sent it to him down at Tiagro, down at where he spent about 40 years. And then he sent me a note that said, I thought I would never forget this. He said it's amorphous blob. So I think that's what he said. He got lost, and I thought, what the hell happened? Did you drop the pages and you put them? You gave me kind of a thumbs up, and I made all the changes you suggested. And now you're telling me this. You talk about a roller coaster with the manuscript to begin with. I thought, this is great, and then it's terrible, and I stopped and started. And so, of course, he was right, and I went in and I fixed a few of the things, and then he gave me a thumbs up. So without him, it probably wasn't readable for most people. So Jack Warner, I have to, he was, this lifelong impact he made on me. But there were so many, Wayne.
Who had quite an influence on me was Jack Warner, because I took his class on film. And of course, now every time I hear water of any sort, I think that it has some sexual meaning in my life. But that was again, for this Catholic school, that was quite an eye opener. That, wow, I used to just go to the movies and just think, there's babbling brooks, there's birds. It's like, no, every one of those things is some hidden meaning that has to do with sex. This is fantastic. So I certainly remember Jack.
But I do recall how much crap we used to give Jack Warner when he had his Fu Manchu. And one day the entire class erupted with cackles and people saying "fu" and animal noises and bird noises and the whole thing. And then the next thing you know, Chuck Conway's at the door. And Jack had completely lost the room. It's
the one I guess I would point out that had the most profound long-term impact on me, though, was Father Jack Warner. He recruited me to be in Destry Rides Again. I don't know if my closest friends know that I'm very shy and more of an introvert than an extrovert. And for me to think I could do that, to learn all the lines, first of all, and to go on stage and to act with boldness and panache, and he was so passionate about it. He just brought that out of me, and take that chance on me. It really, my gosh, it's 3 nights in a packed auditorium. So a shy kid, it just gave me an explosion of confidence, a lifelong love of the theater. I was just so happy to be in it. You were in it. Pat Bannister was in it. He had a line. And it was this big, huge musical. We had the girls from the girls' school. And how many we have in it? We must have had 80 guys in it. We had guys working on. It was just such a great collaboration, as good as any sports team, if not better, the way we all pulled together and had those 3 nights of a packed auditorium. That was great.
And then my other person is Jack Warner, and I had Jack in, they did concentrated English classes for it. So I had him in junior year for a Hemingway course. And that was interesting because I hadn't read anything of his. And then, of course, him directing the play and making a connection that way.